The night was silent, too silent. Somewhere deep in the shadows of a forgotten plantation, a man stood over a lifeless body, his hands steady, his eyes empty, his soul already burned away by years of suffering. They once called him a slave. Now, they whispered a different name, executioner. This is the story they tried to erase, the story of a man who didn't just survive brutality, he answered it, one by one, until 89 names were carved into a legacy of vengeance. And tonight, you're going to hear it all. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. He was not born with hatred, and he was not born with silence either. Once, long before the chains, before the shouting voices, before the heat of the fields burned the skin from his back, he had a voice, a name, and a place where he belonged. It was a small place, surrounded by open land and warm air that carried the sound of laughter instead of pain. There had been nights filled with stories, told under the dim glow of firelight, where elders spoke of strength, of ancestors, of dignity that no man could take away. And for a brief moment in time, he believed that. He believed he was part of something greater, something unbreakable. But the world beyond that place had already begun moving toward him, quietly, mercilessly, and without warning. The day it arrived, it did not come like a storm that could be seen from a distance. It came like a shadow, sudden, suffocating, and impossible to escape. He remembered the confusion first, the loud, unfamiliar sounds, the running, the panic in the air that no one could explain fast enough. Hands grabbed him before he could even understand what was happening, rough and unkind, pulling him away from everything he knew. His mother's voice was the last thing he truly recognized, calling out, breaking apart as she fought against the impossible. That sound, that single moment, stayed with him longer than anything else. Not the chains, not the pain, not even the years that followed. Just that voice, fading. Then silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that fills your chest until it feels like you can't breathe. The kind that replaces who you are with something else entirely. The journey that followed erased whatever remained of the boy he had been. Days blurred into nights, and nights into endless stretches of fear and exhaustion. He learned quickly that questions had no answers, and that resistance had consequences he wasn't ready to face. Around him were others, some older, some younger, but all carrying the same look in their eyes. Confusion slowly turned into understanding, and understanding turned into something heavier, something permanent. By the time he reached the place that would become his prison, he was no longer asking what was happening. He already knew, or at least he knew enough. The plantation did not greet him with words. It didn't need to. The air itself carried a message, thick, heavy, filled with something rotten beneath the surface. The ground was hard, unforgiving, marked by footsteps that had long since lost their direction. And the people moved like shadows of themselves, heads lowered, eyes empty, bodies moving out of habit rather than will. It didn't take long for him to understand why. The first crack of the whip he heard made his entire body freeze. It was sharp, sudden, cutting through the air like a warning that didn't need repeating. He didn't turn to look at first. He didn't need to. The sound alone told him everything. But when he finally did, when his eyes betrayed him and glanced toward the source, what he saw settled deep inside him, planting something that would grow over time into something far more dangerous than fear. Days became structured around pain. Wake before the sun, work until the body could no longer hold itself upright. And when the body failed, punishment followed. There were no exceptions, no mercy, only rules that changed depending on who held the power at any given moment. He learned to move quickly, to anticipate commands before they were spoken, to make himself as invisible as possible in a place where being seen often meant suffering. But invisibility came with its own cost. It meant watching. It meant witnessing everything without reacting, without speaking, without allowing even the smallest sign of resistance to show. And so he watched men twice his size collapse under the weight of exhaustion, only to be dragged back up and forced to continue. He watched women endure cruelty that had no purpose other than to remind them of their place. He watched children like he once was, lose whatever innocence they had left, replaced by the same empty silence that had taken over him. Each moment carved itself into his memory, not fading with time but becoming sharper, clearer, more defined. He didn't understand it yet, but he was collecting something. Not just memories, but reasons. At night, when the work finally stopped and the darkness settled over the plantation, there was no real rest. Bodies lay still, but minds did not. The quiet was filled with soft cries, muffled sobs, and the distant echoes of pain that never truly left. He would lie there, staring into the darkness, his hands still aching, his back burning, his entire body reminding him that he was still alive, but barely. And in those moments, something inside him began to change. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't obvious. It was slow, almost unnoticeable at first. A shift in the way he thought, a shift in the way he felt. Fear, which had once been overwhelming, began to take on a different shape. It was still there, still present, but it no longer controlled him the way it used to. Instead, it became something else, something quieter, something that sat beneath the surface, waiting. He began to notice patterns. The way the overseers moved, the times they chose to appear, the habits they repeated without realizing it. He noticed which ones were cruel for the sake of cruelty, and which ones acted out of something closer to routine. He noticed who drank too much, who stayed up too late, who grew careless when they believed themselves untouchable. These details didn't mean anything to anyone else, but to him they mattered. They gave him something to focus on, something to hold on to in a world designed to strip everything away. There were moments when he almost forgot who he had been before all of this. Moments when the memories of his past felt distant, like something that belonged to someone else. But every now and then, something would bring it back. A sound, a smell, a fragment of a voice carried on the wind. And in those moments, the silence inside him would crack just enough to let something through. Not hope. He had learned that hope was dangerous, but something else, something stronger, something that didn't disappear when things became difficult. The others around him began to notice the difference, even if they couldn't explain it. He didn't break the way others did. He didn't react the way they expected. When punishment came, he endured it without giving them the satisfaction of seeing him fall apart. When orders were given, he followed them without hesitation, but without submission. There was a difference, subtle but real. It showed in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, in the way he seemed to exist both within the system and outside of it at the same time. Some saw it as strength, others saw it as something dangerous, but no one spoke of it openly. Speaking was a risk no one could afford. Time lost its meaning. Days blended together, each one indistinguishable from the last. The sun rose, the work began, the pain followed, and the cycle repeated. But beneath that repetition, something was building. Something that could not be seen, could not be measured, could not be stopped. It was shaped by every moment he had endured, every face he had memorized, every injustice he had witnessed. It was quiet, patient, and waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. He didn't know when that moment would come. He didn't know what it would look like. But he knew, deep down, that it would come. Because a life like this, a place like this, could not exist without consequences. And whether the world was ready for it or not, he was becoming one of them. And so he continued, silent, observing, remembering, not as a victim, not anymore, but as something else entirely. Something that had yet to be fully realized, but was already taking shape in the shadows. The days did not change, but he did. What had once been confusion had hardened into awareness, and what had once been fear had begun to settle into something colder, something quieter, something far more dangerous. The plantation still moved with the same rhythm, the crack of the whip, the weight of the sun, the endless commands shouted by men who believed themselves untouchable, but for him it was no longer just survival, it was observation. Every moment, every movement, every voice became something to study. While others focused only on enduring the next hour, he began to see beyond it. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. He saw weakness where others saw power. And slowly, without anyone realizing it, he began to change his place within that world. At first, it was subtle, a slight hesitation before responding to an order, not enough to be punished, but enough to measure the reaction. A glance held a fraction longer than expected. Not in defiance, but in calculation. He was testing the boundaries, learning where they stretched and where they snapped. The overseers did not notice immediately. To them, he was just another body, another pair of hands in the fields, but bodies that endure without breaking eventually stand out, even in places where suffering is common. And he endured differently. He did not collapse under exhaustion. He did not cry out when the lash struck his back. He absorbed it, as if storing it somewhere deep inside, where it could not be seen but would never be forgotten. It wasn't long before they began to see him as useful. Usefulness in a place like that was not a reward. It was a transformation. It meant being pulled out of the line, singled out, given tasks that others were spared, not because they were easier, but because they were harder in a different way. Tasks that required strength, yes, but also obedience, precision, control, the kind of control that blurred the line between victim and participant. At first it was small things, carrying tools, moving supplies, standing closer to the overseers than the others were allowed. It placed him in a different position, close enough to hear conversations not meant for him, close enough to observe without being questioned. And he listened. He learned the names of the men who held power. Not just their names, but their habits, their tempers, their fears, though they would never admit to having any. He learned which ones drank until their judgment blurred, which ones trusted too easily, which ones relied on routines so heavily that they became predictable. These were not lessons taught with words. They were learned through silence, through patience, through a kind of attention that most people never develop. And he remembered everything. Then came the shift. One afternoon, under a sky that offered no relief from the heat, a man collapsed beside him. It wasn't unusual. It happened often enough that most had learned not to react. But this time, the overseer chose to make an example of it. The order came sharp and immediate. Drag him up, make him stand, remind the others what weakness looked like. The man couldn't stand. His legs refused. His body had reached its limit. And that was when the overseer looked at him, not at the man on the ground, but at him, and gave a different order: handle it. For a moment the world narrowed. The sounds around him faded, the heat became distant, and all that remained was the weight of that command. It wasn't a request, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a test. And in that moment he understood something important. This was how the system sustained itself, not just through force, but through turning the broken into tools, through making victims participate in the suffering of others until the line between them blurred beyond recognition. He stepped forward. The man on the ground looked up at him, eyes filled with something that cut deeper than fear. Recognition, a silent understanding of what was about to happen. For a fraction of a second, something inside him stirred, something that remembered what it felt like to be the one on the ground, to be helpless, to be at the mercy of someone else's decision. But that moment passed, not because it disappeared, but because it was pushed aside, buried beneath something stronger, something that had been building for a long time. He did what he was told. The first time is always the hardest, not because of the act itself, but because of what it means. Because once it is done, something changes that cannot be undone. The overseer watched closely, not just to ensure the task was completed, but to see how he responded. There was no hesitation after that initial pause, no visible emotion, no resistance, just action, controlled, precise, exactly as expected. And when it was over, when the man lay still and the lesson had been delivered, the overseer nodded slightly. Approval. Not spoken, but understood. From that day on, things were different. He was no longer just a laborer. He had become something else, something the overseers could use in ways that went beyond the fields. He was called upon more often, placed in situations where others were not. He was made to stand beside them, to enforce their will, to carry out punishments that were meant to break not just bodies but spirits. And each time, he complied, not out of loyalty, not out of belief, but because he understood something they did not. Every moment brought him closer to something they could not see. The others began to look at him differently, some with fear, some with resentment, some with a kind of quiet understanding that never turned into words. He had crossed a line that most tried desperately to avoid. To them, he might have seemed like he had become part of the system that oppressed them, and in a way, he had. But what they could not see was what lay beneath the surface, the way his silence had changed, the way his eyes no longer reflected submission but calculation, the way every action, no matter how small, seemed to serve a purpose beyond the moment itself. He did not try to explain. There was nothing to explain. Words would not have changed anything. And in a place like that, words were dangerous anyway. So he remained what they saw him as, a tool, a weapon, a man who had adapted in ways they did not understand. But inside, the transformation continued. He became more efficient, more controlled. He learned to separate himself from what he was doing, to create a distance between action and feeling that allowed him to function without hesitation. But that distance was not emptiness, it was storage. Everything he did, everything he witnessed, everything he was forced to become, it all accumulated layer by layer, building towards something that had not yet taken shape, but was already inevitable. The overseers grew to trust him. Trust in their world was a mistake. They gave him more responsibility, more freedom of movement, more access to parts of the plantation that others never saw. They spoke in front of him as if he were invisible, as if his presence did not matter, as if he could not understand or remember. But he did. Every word, every plan, every careless assumption they made about their own security. They believed that by breaking him, they had removed any possibility of resistance. They believed that what stood before them was nothing more than a reflection of their own power. They were wrong. Because while they saw a man who had been shaped into something useful, what they had actually created was something far more dangerous. Someone who knew their world from the inside. Someone who understood their weaknesses better than they understood themselves. Someone who had learned not just how to survive within their system, but how to move through it without being seen. And as the days continued, as the roles became more defined and the expectations more demanding, the final pieces began to fall into place. He no longer questioned what he was becoming. He no longer hesitated when given orders, not because he had accepted them, but because he had moved beyond them. He was no longer reacting to the world around him. He was preparing to change it. The boy who had once been taken, who had once cried out, who had once felt lost in a world that made no sense, he was gone. In his place stood someone who understood exactly where he was, exactly what he was surrounded by, and exactly what it would take to break it. And he was getting closer, closer to the moment when observation would turn into action, closer to the moment when silence would finally speak, closer to the moment when the system that believed it had complete control would realize, too late, that it had created the very thing that would begin to tear it apart from within. By the time the change inside him had fully taken root, the world around him had already stopped recognizing him as anything other than what it had shaped him to be. The transformation was no longer subtle. It lived in the way he moved, in the way he responded, in the way silence followed him instead of surrounding him. The plantation continued as it always had, unforgiving, relentless, blind to the consequences it was quietly creating. But something within that system had begun to shift, even if no one yet understood it, and at the center of that shift stood a man who no longer saw himself as part of the cycle, but as something waiting to break it. He had learned everything they could teach him, absorbed every pattern, memorized every cruelty, and now there was nothing left for him to become within their world, which meant only one thing remained, something outside of it. But moments like that don't arrive suddenly. They build, they gather weight over time, pressing down until something gives. For him it was not one memory, not one act of cruelty, not one command that pushed him forward. It was all of them, layered, connected, impossible to separate. Every scream he had heard in the night, every body that had fallen in the fields, every face that had looked at him not as an enemy, but as someone who might choose differently. Those moments did not disappear. They stayed, they shaped him, and they waited, just like he did. The storm that would change everything did not feel important at first. The sky had been dark since morning, heavy with clouds that blocked out the sun and replaced its burning heat with something colder, something tense. The air felt different, thick in a way that made every breath heavier than it should have been. The overseers were more impatient than usual, their voices sharper, their tempers shorter. Storms did that. They made everything unpredictable, and in a place built on control, unpredictability was dangerous. Work continued despite it. It always did. The ground was harder to move through, the tools heavier in the damp air, but none of that mattered. What mattered was output. What mattered was obedience. And when either of those failed, the consequences followed without hesitation. It happened quickly. A young boy, too young for the work he had been forced into, too small to carry the weight placed on him, stumbled. His body gave out before his will did. He hit the ground with a dull thud, the kind that didn't echo but still carried meaning. For a brief moment, everything seemed to pause, not because anyone cared, but because everyone knew what would come next. The overseer saw it immediately. There was no concern in his expression, no question, just irritation, as if the boy's collapse was nothing more than an inconvenience, a disruption in the rhythm he expected to maintain. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the moment heavier. The others kept their heads down. They always did. Looking meant acknowledging. Acknowledging meant risking attention, and attention was the last thing anyone wanted. But he always looked. The boy tried to push himself up, his arms trembling, his body refusing to cooperate. There was desperation in the movement, a silent plea that didn't need words. It wasn't just about avoiding punishment, it was about survival. But survival, in that place, was not always something effort could guarantee. The overseer spoke, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The command was simple. Stand. The boy tried again, failed again. The second failure was enough. Order changed. And this time, it was not directed at the boy. It was directed at him. There was no hesitation in the overseer's voice, no doubt, no uncertainty. He had been given this role before, he had carried out similar commands before. But something about this moment was different. Maybe it was the boy's age. Maybe it was the way his eyes searched for something, anything, that might save him. Or maybe it was simply the accumulation of everything that had come before, finally reaching a point where it could no longer be contained. He stepped forward. The ground beneath his feet felt heavier than usual, as if each step carried more weight than it should have. The boy looked up at him, and in that look was something that cut deeper than any wound he had ever received. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition, a silent understanding of what was about to happen. But beneath that fear, there was something else, something fragile, something almost impossible in a place like that. Hope. For a fraction of a second, everything slowed. The sounds of the plantation faded into the background. The murmurs, the movements, even the distant rumble of the storm seemed to disappear. All that remained was the space between them, the man who had been shaped into a weapon, and the child who still believed somehow that he might choose not to use it. His hands tightened, not out of anger, not out of obedience, but because something inside him was shifting, pushing against everything he had become, everything he had learned to suppress. Memories surfaced, unwanted, uninvited, but impossible to ignore. A voice calling out, a hand reaching for him, a moment when he had been the one looking up, searching for something that never came. The overseer's voice broke through, sharper now, impatient, a reminder, a command. The moment could not last, and so it ended. The first movement was mechanical, almost detached, as if his body had made the decision before his mind could fully catch up. The second movement carried more force. The third, even more. Each action blurred into the next, not because he had lost control, but because he had surrendered to something deeper than control. The boy's cries filled the air, cutting through the silence that had once defined him. But he did not stop. He could not stop, not because he wasn't able to, but because stopping would mean something else entirely, something he was not ready to face. The storm broke above them. Rain fell hard, heavy, washing over everything, over the ground, over the bodies, over the moment itself. But it did not change what was happening. It did not soften it. It only made it harder to see clearly, as if the world itself was trying to blur the edges of what could not be undone. When it was over, the boy lay still. The rain continued. The overseer said nothing. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. The example had been made. And just like that, the moment passed, for everyone else, but not for him. He stood there, unmoving, the rain soaking through him, the weight of what had just happened settling into something deeper than memory. He waited for something, for guilt, for hesitation, for anything that might connect him to what he had just done. But nothing came, no hesitation, no regret, no feeling that matched what should have been there. And that was when he understood something had broken. Not in the boy, not in the system, but in him. The part of him that once reacted, that once felt in ways that could interfere with action, that part was gone. Not hidden, not suppressed, gone. Replaced by something colder, something clearer, something that did not hesitate, did not question, did not resist. The rain washed the ground clean, but it could not wash that away. From that moment on, everything changed. Not on the surface. The plantation continued as it always had. The routines remained. The commands were still given, still followed. To anyone watching, nothing was different. But inside him, the shift was complete. He no longer saw himself as part of their system, not even as something trapped within it. He saw it for what it was. A structure built on repetition, on predictability, on the assumption that those within it would never move beyond the roles assigned to them. And he had moved beyond. The boy's face did not leave him, not as a source of guilt, but as a marker, a line drawn between what he had been and what he had become. It was not a moment he would forget. It was a moment he would carry, not as a burden, but as a turning point, because in losing what remained of his hesitation, he had gained something else, clarity, the kind of clarity that does not come from understanding the world as it is, but from seeing exactly how it can be undone. That was the night the last piece fell into place, the night the silence inside him stopped being empty and started becoming something else entirely, the night the slave disappeared and something far more dangerous took his place. After that night, nothing looked different, but everything was. The plantation still breathed the same suffocating air, the same commands still echoed across the fields, the same rhythm of labor and punishment continued without interruption. To anyone watching, the system remained untouched, unchallenged, permanent, but inside him, something had settled into place with a precision that could not be undone. The hesitation that once lingered between thought and action had vanished, replaced by something colder, something exact. He no longer reacted to the world around him, he calculated it. Every movement he made, every word he chose not to speak, every glance he allowed himself to take, it all served a purpose now. The transformation was complete, but its direction had finally become clear. Revenge, for most, is loud, it is reckless, it burns fast and disappears just as quickly. But what lived inside him was not that kind of fire. It was quiet, patient. It did not rush, because it did not need to. It had been building for too long to waste itself in a single moment of anger. Instead, it waited, watching the same way he had learned to watch since the beginning. Only now, he wasn't just observing to survive, he was observing to act. He began to study them differently, not as masters, not as overseers, but as men who believed themselves untouchable, men who moved through the plantation with a confidence that came from years of unchallenged power. Men who had never needed to question their safety because the world they lived in had never given them a reason to. That was their weakness, not their strength, and he saw it clearly. He knew their routines better than they did. The times they walked alone, believing the darkness was something that protected them rather than concealed something else. The paths they took without thinking, worn into habit through repetition. The moments when their attention slipped, when their focus shifted just enough to leave space for something unexpected. These were not random observations. They were pieces of something larger, something that was slowly taking shape in his mind. He did not act immediately. He waited. Days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into something longer, but his patience never wavered. If anything, it sharpened. Each passing day added more detail, more certainty, more control. He was no longer reacting to opportunity, he was creating it. And when the moment finally came, it did not feel sudden. It felt inevitable. The first name was not chosen by chance. It could not be. It had to mean something. It had to carry weight, not just for him, but for everything that would follow. The man he chose was not the cruelest, nor the most powerful. He was something else, consistent, predictable, a man whose actions had repeated so often, so precisely, that they had become part of the structure itself. A man who had delivered pain without thought, without hesitation, without consequence. A man who believed that what he did would never return to him. That belief was what made him the first. The night was quiet, but not in the way it had been before. This was a different kind of silence, one that felt heavy, deliberate, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The sky was clear, the air still, and the darkness deep enough to hide anything that chose to move within it. It was the kind of night where nothing seemed out of place, until it was. He moved without sound, not because he was trying to be careful, but because he had become careful. Every step was measured, every motion controlled, every breath steady. There was no rush, no uncertainty, only direction. He knew exactly where he was going, exactly when he would arrive, exactly what would happen when he did. The man was alone. Of course he was. That was part of the pattern, part of the routine he had followed without question for longer than he could remember. A walk taken at the same time each night, along the same path, with the same careless confidence that had never been challenged. Until now, for a moment, he watched, not because he needed to, but because it was part of the process. A final confirmation, a final understanding. This was not about impulse, this was about certainty. And when that certainty settled into place, he stepped forward. There was no warning, no sound, no chance to react. The man's confidence disappeared in an instant, replaced by confusion that never had time to turn into fear. The struggle, if it could be called that, was brief, controlled, precise. Over before it could fully begin. And then, silence, real silence. Not the kind forced by fear or maintained by power, but the kind that comes when something ends completely. He stood there for a moment, looking down at what he had done, not searching for meaning, not questioning the action, but recognizing it. This was the beginning, not the act itself, but what it represented. A line that had been crossed, not in desperation, but in decision. There was no going back from this, no returning to what had been before, but he had already known that. He had known it long before this moment arrived. He did not linger. He did not allow the moment to stretch into something it did not need to be. Instead, he moved, just as he had planned, just as he had prepared. The path away was as carefully chosen as the path toward. Every step erased, every trace minimized, every detail accounted for. By the time the night settled back into its usual stillness, there was nothing left to suggest what had happened, except one thing: absence. Morning came the same way it always did, but the plantation did not feel the same. It started small, a delay, a question, a name called without response. At first it was dismissed. People went missing sometimes, it was not unheard of. But as the hours passed, as the absence remained, something began to shift. The body was found, and with it, something else, confusion, not fear, not yet, but something close to it, something unfamiliar. Because this was not how things were supposed to happen. This was not part of the system. There were rules, unspoken but understood, about who held power and who did not, about who acted and who reacted. And this did not fit. Questions were asked. Answers did not come. The overseers searched for explanations, for someone to blame, for something that could restore the sense of control they had always relied on. But there was nothing. No witnesses, no evidence. No sign of struggle beyond what could not be explained. And him? He was exactly where he was supposed to be, working, silent, unchanged. At least that was what they saw. But inside something had shifted again. Not dramatically, not violently, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper than anything before it. It had begun. The system had been touched, not broken, not yet, but disturbed. And that disturbance would not fade. It would grow. Slowly. Quietly, the same way he returned to his routine as if nothing had happened, the same movements, the same silence, the same presence that had become invisible to those who believed they understood him. But now, every moment carried a different weight, every observation, every detail, every pattern he had memorized. It all had purpose now. The first name had been written, and it would not be the last, because what he had started was not an act, it was a process. One that would unfold the same way it had begun, carefully, deliberately, without waste, without hesitation. A process built on everything he had learned, everything he had endured, everything he had become. And as the plantation tried to return to its normal rhythm, as the overseers convinced themselves that this was an isolated incident, something that could be explained, something that could be controlled, he watched, and he waited, because he knew something they did not. This was only the beginning. And the silence they thought had returned was no longer empty. The plantation tried to recover, to fold the disturbance back into its routine, as if nothing had truly changed. But the illusion of control, once cracked, never fully repairs itself. What had begun as confusion quietly evolved into something more unstable, something that moved beneath the surface of daily life like an unseen current. The absence of the first man did not fade into the background the way they had expected. Instead, it lingered. It hung in the air during early mornings when orders were given a little more sharply than before. It crept into conversations that stopped abruptly when someone walked too close. It lived in the small, almost imperceptible pauses that began to appear in places where certainty had once existed. And for him, it was confirmation. Not of success, but of possibility. He did not rush forward. That was never his way. What he had started was not meant to be loud, not meant to be obvious, not meant to reveal itself all at once. It was meant to spread, slowly, carefully, until it could no longer be contained. So he returned to his silence, to his routine, to the same careful observation that had guided him to this point. But now, everything he saw carried new meaning. Every reaction, every change in behavior, every shift in tone, it all became part of a larger understanding. The system was not as strong as it believed itself to be. It was not unbreakable. It only appeared that way because no one had ever truly challenged it from within. That was what made him different. He was not an outsider looking in. He was not a force arriving from beyond their reach. He was already inside, already moving through their world, already part of the structure they relied on. And that made him something they could not anticipate, something they could not prepare for, because to them he did not exist as a threat. He existed as a function, a role, a tool, and tools are not expected to turn. Days passed, and the tension grew in ways that could not be openly acknowledged. The overseers became more cautious, though they would never admit it. They moved in pairs more often. They checked their surroundings with slightly more attention. They spoke of the incident less, but thought about it more. Fear, when it first appears, rarely announces itself. It hides behind reason, behind denial, behind the insistence that everything is still under control. But it changes behavior, and behavior, no matter how carefully masked, can always be seen by someone who is watching closely enough. He saw everything, and he adjusted. The next names were chosen with the same care as the first, but with one important difference. Now he understood not just how to act, but how those actions would ripple outward. The first had created confusion, the next would create doubt. And doubt, once introduced, spreads faster than anything else. The second man was not careless. He was not predictable in the same way as the first. But he had something else, a sense of authority that bordered on arrogance. He believed himself aware, alert, above the kind of mistake that had taken the first life. That belief made him dangerous. But it also made him vulnerable. Because confidence, when it is built on assumptions rather than reality, blinds as effectively as ignorance. This time the approach was different. Not slower, not faster, just different. He did not rely on routine alone. He created a new one, subtle shifts, small changes that guided the man into a position he believed he had chosen himself. It took longer, required more patience, more precision. But the result was the same, silent, final. When the second body was found, the reaction was not confusion, it was concern, not spoken openly, not acknowledged directly, but present, undeniable. The pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Two incidents, two men, no explanation, no clear connection beyond the fact that both had existed within a system that was now showing signs of fracture. Questions became sharper. Searches became more thorough, but still, nothing, no witnesses, no traces, no answers. And in the absence of answers, something else began to grow, suspicion. Not just outward, but inward. They began to look at each other differently, to question what they thought they knew, to wonder if only briefly whether the threat came from outside or from within. It was a dangerous thought, one they tried to suppress. But once introduced, it could not be completely erased. He continued. The third, the fourth, each one chosen not just for what they had done, but for what their absence would create. Some were cruel beyond measure, their actions etched deeply into the memories of those around them. Others were less obvious, their cruelty hidden beneath routine, normalized to the point where it no longer stood out. But he remembered. He always remembered. And with each act, the effect multiplied. Fear began to take shape, not as panic, not yet, but as awareness. A constant, quiet awareness that something was wrong, that something had changed, that the world they believed they controlled was no longer entirely theirs. The nights became different. Doors that once remained open were now closed. Paths that were once walked without thought were now avoided or taken with caution. Conversations that once carried confidence now carried uncertainty. The overseers still held power, but it no longer felt absolute, and power that feels uncertain begins to weaken. He moved through it all without drawing attention. His role remained intact, his presence unchanged. If anything, he became more reliable, more consistent, more exactly what they expected him to be. Because the less he stood out, the less he was seen. And the less he was seen, the more freely he could act. The number grew, slowly, deliberately. Each name added not just to a count, but to a message. This was not random, this was not chaos, this was memory, taking form. By the time the number reached 10, the plantation was no longer the same place it had been. The structure still stood, the work still continued, but beneath it all something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The certainty was gone. The assumption of safety had been replaced by something else, something heavier, fear, real fear. The kind that does not disappear when the sun rises, the kind that follows you, that waits with you, that whispers in moments of silence and grows louder in moments of doubt. And still, they did not see him, not truly. They saw the results. They felt the impact, but the source remained invisible, because they were not looking for someone like him. They were looking for something else, something external, something separate from the system they trusted. They could not imagine that the threat had been shaped by that very system, that it had grown within it, that it had learned from it. But it had, and it was still learning, still adapting, still waiting for the right moments, the right conditions, the right names. The plantation had begun to feel smaller, not in size, but in certainty. The boundaries that once defined it no longer felt secure. Every shadow carried possibility, every silence carried weight, every absence carried meaning. And through it all, he remained exactly what he needed to be, unseen, unquestioned, unstoppable, because what had begun as a single act had now become something else entirely. A pattern, a presence, a force that could not be traced, could not be predicted, could not be stopped by the methods they understood. And as the number continued to rise, as the fear deepened, as the system struggled to maintain the illusion of control, he watched and he continued, one name at a time, until the message was no longer something they could ignore, until the balance had shifted so far that it could never return to what it had been, until the silence they had relied on belonged to him. By the time fear fully settled into the bones of the plantation, it no longer needed to announce itself. It lived there now, quiet, constant, unavoidable. It moved through the same spaces where power once stood unquestioned, reshaping everything without ever revealing its true form. The overseers still gave orders, still raised their voices, still tried to maintain the structure they had always relied on, but something essential had changed. Their words carried less certainty, their movements held more caution, their authority, though still visible, no longer felt absolute. And at the center of that shift, though no one could see it clearly, was him. He had become something more than a man acting in secret. He had become a presence, not seen, not named, but felt, the kind of presence that alters behavior without ever stepping into the light, the kind that forces those in power to question the very ground beneath their feet. And yet, he remained exactly where he had always been, within the system, moving through it as if nothing had changed. That was his greatest strength. He did not need to hide, because no one was truly looking at him. They were looking for something else, something obvious, something that matched their understanding of danger. But he had already moved beyond their understanding. The number continued to rise, not quickly, not recklessly, but with the same precision that had defined everything he had done from the beginning. Each name added carried weight, not just in memory, but in effect. By now the pattern could no longer be denied. This was no accident, no coincidence. It was something deliberate, something controlled. And that realization brought with it a kind of fear that no amount of force could suppress. They began to respond, not with clarity, but with desperation. Guards were increased, patrols were extended, orders became stricter, punishments harsher, as if tightening control could somehow restore what had already been lost. But these actions did not strengthen the system. They weakened it further, because fear-driven control is never stable. It creates cracks, it exposes flaws, it forces mistakes. And he was waiting for those mistakes. He watched as they changed their routines, trying to adapt to something they could not see. But in changing, they became unpredictable, not in a way that protected them, but in a way that made them vulnerable. They abandoned the patterns he had once relied on, but in doing so, they created new ones, less stable, less consistent, easier to manipulate. Because chaos, when understood, can be shaped just as easily as order, he adjusted, always. That was the difference between him and them. They reacted, he anticipated. They tried to control what was happening, he understood it, and in understanding it, he stayed ahead, always just out of reach, always one step beyond their attempts to contain him. The number passed 20, then 30. Each new absence struck harder than the last, not because of who was lost, but because of what it represented. The system was no longer holding, it was being challenged in a way that could not be openly confronted, because to confront it, they would first have to understand it, and they did not. Rumors spread beyond the plantation. At first they were dismissed, stories exaggerated, distorted, turned into something easier to ignore. But as the pattern continued, as the numbers grew, those rumors began to carry weight. Other plantations began to hear of it. Other overseers, other masters, began to question their own security, their own certainty. The fear was no longer contained, it was spreading, and still, no one knew where it began. He moved through it all without changing his role. If anything, he became more valuable, more trusted, more essential to the very structure he was dismantling. The overseers relied on him now, not just for labor, but for enforcement, for order, for the very control they believed they still possessed. They gave him access, freedom of movement, responsibility. They placed him closer to power, and in doing so they gave him everything he needed. The number reached 40. By then, the plantation was no longer just afraid, it was unstable. The balance that had once held everything in place was gone. In its place was something fragile, something uncertain, something that could collapse at any moment. The overseers tried to hold it together, but their efforts only revealed how little control they actually had. Some began to suspect something deeper, something internal, but suspicion without proof leads nowhere. It creates tension, doubt, mistrust, but not clarity, and without clarity they remained lost. He saw it all, felt it all, but remained untouched by it. Because what he was doing was no longer just about revenge, it had become something larger, a message, not spoken, not written, but understood. The oppressed were no longer silent, not in the way they had been before. The system that had relied on that silence was now being forced to confront something it could not control, could not suppress, could not fully comprehend. And the number continued to climb, 50, 60, each one bringing the plantation closer to something inevitable, collapse. Not immediate, not explosive, but slow, steady, unavoidable, because systems built on fear can only survive as long as fear flows in one direction. And now, it flowed both ways. The overseers felt it, the masters felt it. Even those who had once believed themselves completely removed from its reach began to understand that distance no longer guaranteed safety. No one was beyond it, no one was untouchable. And that realization changed everything. He no longer needed to move as often. The fear itself was doing part of the work, disrupting routines, breaking confidence, creating mistakes. All he had to do was continue, carefully, precisely, without losing control. The number reached 89, and by then the plantation was no longer the same place it had been. It could not be. Too much had changed, too much had been lost, too much had been revealed. The system still stood, but it stood on something weaker now, something fractured, something that could not hold forever. And at the center of it all was the truth they had never considered, that what they had created, what they had shaped through years of cruelty and control, had not remained what they intended it to be. It had adapted, learned, evolved into something they could not stop, something they could not even fully see. The man they had once broken was gone. In his place stood something else entirely, not just a survivor, not just a witness, but a force shaped by everything they had done, a force that did not need recognition, did not need validation, did not need to be understood, only to continue. And as the final number settled into place, As the weight of 89 names hung over the plantation like a shadow that would never fully lift, one truth remained. This was not an end. It was a transformation, one that had already begun, one that could not be undone, one that would be remembered, not in records, not in history books, but in the quiet understanding that systems built on suffering do not last forever, because eventually they create something that answers back, and then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, it stopped, not gradually, not with warning, not with a final act that could be pointed to and understood. It simply ended. The pattern that had come to define every waking moment of the plantation, the fear, the uncertainty, the constant awareness that something unseen was moving among them, fell into an unnatural stillness. Days passed, then weeks, and no new names were added. No new absences appeared. No new signs emerged to suggest that the force which had reshaped their world was still active. At first, no one trusted it. How could they? Silence, in a place that had learned to fear it, no longer felt like peace. It felt like waiting, like the breath held just before something happens. The overseers did not relax, not immediately. They continued their patrols, their checks, their guarded routines, as if expecting the pattern to return at any moment. They spoke less openly than before, and when they did speak, it was in tones that carried more caution than authority. The confidence that had once defined them was gone, not entirely, but enough that it could no longer hide behind habit. Something had changed within them, something they could not undo simply because the events had stopped. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest fears. As the days stretched into longer periods without incident, as the nights passed without interruption, something else began to take hold: relief. Quiet at first, hesitant, almost unwilling to show itself, but it grew. Slowly, carefully, the routines began to settle back into place. Doors that had remained tightly closed began to open again. Paths that had been avoided were walked once more. Conversations regained fragments of their former certainty. Not completely, but enough to create the illusion that the danger had passed. That illusion was fragile, and beneath it, questions remained. What had happened? Why had it stopped? And most importantly, where had it gone? There were no answers, only speculation. Some believed it had been an outsider, a presence that had come and gone, leaving destruction behind without ever revealing itself. Others insisted it had been something internal, something born within the plantation itself, something that had simply disappeared. There were those who whispered of escape, that whoever had done this had finally found a way out, leaving the system behind after reshaping it in ways that could never be undone. And then there were the darker whispers, that it had not left at all, that it was still there, watching, waiting. The uncertainty never fully faded. It lingered, even as the routines returned, even as the system tried to rebuild itself around what remained. Because once a truth like that has been revealed, that control is not absolute, that power is not untouchable. It cannot be forgotten. It becomes part of the foundation, altering everything that stands on it. And him? He was gone, not in the way the others had been, not as an absence discovered and questioned, but as something that simply ceased to be part of the visible world. There was no moment where he was last seen, no clear point where his presence ended. One day he was there, moving through the same spaces, carrying out the same roles, existing as he always had, and then, without announcement, without disruption, he wasn't. It was as if he had dissolved into the very silence he had once used to move unseen. Some noticed, not immediately, not in a way that caused alarm, but gradually, as patterns began to settle again, as faces became familiar once more, his absence registered, a missing piece in a structure that had already been fractured. But by then, there was no way to trace it, no way to determine when it had happened, no way to connect it to what had come before with certainty, because he had never allowed himself to be seen clearly in the first place. That was his final act, not a confrontation, not a declaration, but a disappearance, clean, complete, unanswered. The system he left behind tried to move forward. It had no other choice. Work continued, orders were given, life in its harsh, unrelenting way pushed on. But it did so differently now. The confidence was gone. The certainty had been replaced by something else, something quieter, something more cautious, something that acknowledged, even if only deep down, that what had happened could happen again. Because nothing had truly been resolved, there had been no capture, no explanation, no closure, only an ending that did not feel like an ending at all. In time, the story began to change. As stories always do, details shifted. Numbers were questioned, events were retold in ways that made them easier to understand, easier to accept. Some dismissed it entirely, reducing it to exaggeration, to rumor, to something that had grown larger in the telling than it had ever been in reality. Others held onto it more tightly, preserving it in whispers, in quiet conversations, in warnings passed from one voice to another. Because stories like this do not disappear. They transform, they become something else, something that exists not in records or documents, but in memory, in feeling, in the subtle ways they shape how people see the world around them. And his story became exactly that, a presence without a face, a force without a name, a reminder that systems built on control can be challenged in ways they do not expect. There were those who claimed to have seen him after, in places far from where it had all begun, a figure moving through shadows, silent, controlled, unchanged. But those were only stories, or perhaps something more, because the truth was never confirmed. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the truth was never meant to be something that could be captured or contained. Maybe it was meant to remain just out of reach, just beyond certainty, existing in that space where fear and understanding meet, because if he had been found, if his story had been fully explained, it would have ended there, contained, defined, controlled. But it didn't end that way. It remained open, unresolved, alive in the only way that truly matters, and that is what made it powerful. Not just what he did, not just how it happened, but the fact that it could not be fully understood, that it left behind more questions than answers, that it forced those who heard it to confront something deeper than the events themselves. The realization that what had happened was not impossible, that it had happened, and that it could happen again, because the system he left behind, though changed, though weakened, though marked by everything that had occurred, still existed, still carried the same foundations, still held the same assumptions, and those assumptions had already been proven wrong. He had shown them that, without ever standing in the light, without ever revealing himself completely, without ever needing to, and in the end, that was his greatest act. Not the names, not the numbers, but the absence, the silence that followed, the space he left behind, that could never be filled, because once something like that has existed, once it has moved through a place and reshaped it in ways that cannot be undone, it never truly leaves. It remains in memory, in fear, in the quiet understanding that beneath the surface of control, something else can always be waiting, watching, learning, becoming, just as he once did. Time moved forward, as it always does, but it did not erase what had happened. It never truly does. The plantation continued to exist, though not in the same way. Something fundamental had shifted, something invisible yet permanent, something that could not be repaired or restored, no matter how much those in power tried to pretend otherwise. The structure remained, the routines returned, the system carried on. But beneath it all, there was a fracture, a quiet, lingering awareness that what had once been certain was no longer guaranteed. And that awareness, though rarely spoken aloud, changed everything. At first, they tried to bury it, not physically. There were no records to erase, no documents to destroy, no official accounts to rewrite. What had happened had never been written down in the first place. It lived in memory, in whispered conversations, in glances exchanged when certain topics came too close to the surface. And so, instead of erasing it, they attempted something else. They minimized it, reduced it, turned it into something smaller, something less threatening. A series of unfortunate events, a period of unrest, a disruption that had passed. But no matter how they tried to reshape it, they could not fully remove the weight it carried, because the people remembered, not just the events themselves, but the feeling of them, the nights when silence felt heavier than sound, the days when power no longer felt untouchable, the realization, quiet but undeniable, that something within their world had changed in a way that could not be reversed, and that memory did not belong to just one group. It existed on both sides of the system, though it took on very different meanings depending on where it was held. For those who had lived under the weight of that system, the story became something else entirely, not just a memory of fear, but a memory of possibility. Not hope in the way people often think of it, not something bright or comforting, but something deeper, something more grounded. The understanding that the structure surrounding them, no matter how strong it appeared, was not beyond challenge, that it could be touched, that it could be shaken, that it could be changed. They did not speak of him openly, not because they had forgotten, but because they understood the power of silence. The same silence that had once been forced upon them had been transformed into something else, something chosen, something intentional. They carried the story carefully, passing it only when necessary, only when it would be understood, not as a tale of violence, but as a reminder that endurance is not the same as submission, a reminder that survival can take many forms, a reminder that even within the most controlled systems, there are spaces where something unexpected can grow. And on the other side, the side that had once held unquestioned authority, the memory took a different shape. It became caution, not always acknowledged, not always admitted, but present nonetheless. The confidence that had once defined them never fully returned. It couldn't, because confidence built on the assumption of absolute control cannot survive the realization that control can be broken. They adapted, in their own way, tightened structures, increased oversight, changed routines, but these changes, though meant to restore stability, were built on a new understanding, a quieter one that did not trust as easily, did not assume as much, did not ignore the possibility that something similar could happen again, because they had seen it happen once, and that was enough. As the years passed, the story began to move beyond the place where it had started, not as a clear, defined narrative, but as fragments. Pieces carried from one place to another, reshaped slightly each time they were told, influenced by the voices that carried them and the ears that received them. Some versions emphasized the numbers, others focused on the mystery. Some spoke of him as a man, others as something more than that, something symbolic, something almost beyond human. But no matter how the details changed, the core remained the same. There had been someone, he had come from within, and he had changed everything. In some tellings he became a warning, in others a legend, in a few something closer to a question. What happens when a system built on control pushes too far? What happens when silence is forced for so long that it transforms into something else? What happens when someone who has been shaped by that system learns to move beyond it? These were not questions with simple answers, and perhaps that was why the story endured, because it did not offer resolution, it did not provide comfort. It did not end in a way that allowed people to move on easily. Instead, it remained open, unfinished, a presence rather than a conclusion. And him? He remained exactly as he had left, undefined, uncontained. Not because no one tried to define him, but because no single definition could hold everything he represented. To some, he was a man who had taken revenge, nothing more, nothing less. To others, he was something deeper, a reflection of everything that had been done, everything that had been endured, everything that had been pushed beyond its limit. But perhaps the most accurate understanding was the simplest one. He was a consequence, not born from a single moment, not created by a single act, but shaped over time by repetition, by cruelty, by a system that believed it could act without ever being answered. And in the end, it was answered, not with words, not with rebellion in the way history often records it, but with something quieter, something more precise, something that moved through the system itself and revealed its weaknesses from within. That was his legacy. Not just what he did, but what he showed. That power, no matter how strong it appears, is never absolute. That control, no matter how complete it seems, always has limits. That silence, no matter how deeply it is enforced, can become something else entirely. And that something else can change everything. The story was never written in official records. It was never taught, never preserved in the ways most histories are, but it survived anyway, because the most powerful stories do not rely on ink or paper. They live in memory, in feeling, in the quiet understanding passed from one generation to the next. And even now, long after the events themselves have faded into the distance, long after the names have been lost or changed or forgotten, the story remains, not as something distant, not as something separate, but as something that still speaks, softly, quietly, but clearly, to anyone willing to listen, because it is not just a story about the past. It is a story about what happens when systems forget their limits, about what rises when those limits are pushed too far, about the kind of force that does not announce itself, does not seek recognition, does not need to be seen, only to exist, only to act, only to remind the world that nothing built on suffering can stand forever, and that sometimes the answer does not come from the outside, it comes from within.